Hello, welcome everyone, and good morning. Welcome to our annual Human in the Data Graduate Student Symposium. We are pleased to feature our 2022 MnDRIVE Human in the Data Fellows today, and we'll later in this program discuss how one might apply to be a fellow for this coming summer. My name is Michael Beckstrand. I facilitate the summer fellowship for the Human in the Data Fellows and serve as a research associate in Lattice in the College of Liberal Arts. We'll do our best to offer descriptions of what you might see on your screen today when we're screen sharing, and that includes myself. I am a white, nearly 40-year-old male with a goofy looking mustache and a striped sweater. The Human in the Data initiative focuses on the ubiquity of big data and the algorithmic decision-making in every major section of our world. This summer fellowship program, which is sponsored by MnDRIVE, enables our 8 graduate students to pursue non-traditional interdisciplinary research projects that focus on the humanistic implications of the 5 main elements of the MnDRIVE concentration. Those elements are robotics, global food systems, the environment and environmental change, brain conditions, or cancer and clinical trials. In today's event and this program at large, it would not be possible without the support of MnDRIVE through the Institute for Advanced Study, DASH, Lattice, and the Center for Research Computing. And we thank them and their support for supporting these students and the projects you're about to hear about today. Before we fully begin, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement that continues to be a work in progress as we deal with the university's relations with the 11 tribal nations sharing a geography with this state we now call Minnesota. The Institute for Advanced Study and DASH respectfully acknowledge that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Dakota people. The University of Minnesota was founded as a land grant institution, and we recognize that that founding came at a dire cost to the Dakota people. They were forced to cede their lands in return for goods and services, which the government did not in the end provide. And in not upholding these treaties, it led to widespread devastation. We recognize this painful past, and we honor the Dakota people's history on this land, their sovereignty over it, and their continued contributions to this region. We also recognize the Dakota and numerous other indigenous peoples as the original stewards of the land we are now on and all their relatives in it, who had thriving and vibrant communities prior to this disruption by white settlers. Today, the state of Minnesota shares geography with these 11 tribal nations, and by offering this land acknowledgement, myself and these institutions affirm the tribal sovereignty of these nations, and we hold the University of Minnesota accountable to recognize and counter the historical and contemporary injustices that continue to impact Indigenous people, and strive for mutually beneficial partnerships between the university and these communities. This year's Human in the Data graduate fellows have engaged in Indigenous ways of knowing. They have highlighted the voices of the marginalized, the othered, and others ignored by history, and they have helped us understand better the challenges facing the land where we work and live. I share my gratitude for them and for you, our guests, and I'm looking forward to the time we will spend together today. Before we get any further into the program, I do want to say a few final words on sort of technical features as we're going through here. We do have Zoom's auto captionings enabled today. And so if you would like to turn those on, please click the show captions button on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then choose show subtitles or a view full transcript. We will have opportunities for audience questions as we go through our program today. We're having 2 sets of 4 presenters from our 8 fellows, and so we will have saved questions for the first 4 until after they have completed their presentation. When that's done, we'll have some time for Q&A, then we will proceed to the second 4 presenters, and again have time for Q&A. We can collect those via the Q&A feature in this Zoom meeting. You should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And also our group is small enough. And so during those Q&A sessions, if you would like to unmute your video and audio and share a question that way, or share a question in the chat, that all those options are available to you. To introduce our share resources and have any conversations while we're going, we also invite you to use the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself at this time if you'd like the rest of the group to know who you are, and feel free to also add comments and conversation as you are going throughout today. Make sure as you're doing that you have send chat marked to everyone so we can all engage in the conversation. And as I mentioned earlier, following this symposium, the presentations by our graduate students and the Q&A and discussion that results from these presentations, we will move to an information session that is scheduled to start at 12 noon. That will provide an opportunity to get more information about applying to become a Human in the Data Summer Fellow for this coming summer. We'll talk about the application requirements and have other opportunities for questions about the logistics of that process. All right. Without any further ado, let us move to our featured presentation and start hearing from the excellent projects that we've experienced over this past year, the summer and the following semester, I suppose. And so to begin, it is my pleasure now to introduce Catherine Pierpont, who is a doctoral student in the history department. The MnDRIVE thematic area her project focused on was the environment, and the presentation she is going to give us today is entitled Welcome to the Jungle, Mapping Community in the 12th Century Toulouse. With that, I turn it over to Catherine.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. So first of all, thank you to the Human in the Data program. It has been really great. I encourage anyone and everyone to apply to it. So I'm gonna share an image of my map, and I'm kind of gonna talk through a little bit of the difficulties of my research and how it engages with ArcGIS and the benefits and problems therein. So first of all, I study sex work in the 12th century. There's not a lot of documents on sex work in the 12th century, and I include a particular type of performer known as a jongleur in the category of sex work. And I'd love to talk about that, but I definitely don't have time. So feel free to ask me about it or email me about it later. Basically, the only place where I found these individuals is in property records. And so I started to map those property records. What I have here already on the map, these are actually just pins to remind me of something to add to my map later. But these street names are the 12th century names of these different areas. So you see that we have the Rue of Pellardy le Jongleur, which is named after a specific performer. And we have the Rue de Jongleur over here, along with a couple other street names that are important for context in my larger project. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to show the various points where I have found jongleurs. This was color-coded, but as I said I would mention in my Q&A, the technology does not always work as you want, and it takes longer than you think. So be aware of that. But here we see Jordan joculator, that's the Latin form for jongleur. This is a larger landmark. And here we can see another property of Jordan joculator. Over here, we see Arnaldus. So one of the first things that mapping this data allowed me to see is actually that we don't have any property records that I'm aware of jongleurs on the Rue de Jongleur. And this point right here on Rue de Pellardy le Jongleur is actually just conjecture by me, because I'm assuming that Pellardy lives on the street that's named after him. So a lot of my map sort of points to the way that mapping is an interpretive process. And that is obviously important to remember when we're looking at any map. So as some of my transparency, I've also included larger areas that I'm using to understand where I think different properties might exist. So this area is called a salvetat, which is actually sort of a designation by the count of a tax-free zone. And you'll notice a lot of the properties we see are right along that area. This is where the historical evidence and interpretation meet, because this church, and there's another church right here, there are two churches right here, we know that the jongleurs live around them. This area is a wine tax-free area. So in many ways, it makes a lot of sense that we see more properties near the salvetat. But I would also be lying if I said the existence of the salvetat didn't affect my understanding of where I think some of these properties are. So it's a back and forth. We additionally have some property over here. This area, we know that there's another jongleur that lives somewhere in between these two landmarks. And so I haven't actually placed a point there, but I've placed this larger polygon in order to kind of denote, you know, we know that somewhere in here, one of these people lives. It's sort of similar with what's happening over here, is there are two distinct properties. One that I believe is named after a jongleur, and the other, we know he has land near that area. And so what seems logical to me, again, in an interpretive process, is to place the point where he most likely owns property where those two places meet. And finally, some of this also relies on roadmaps, literally, because there are no real street names other than street names by profession. If you know that a jongleur lives next to a shoemaker and you have a road of the shoemakers, you might consider a logical conclusion that the jongleur lives on the road of the shoemakers. So a lot of interpretation and a lot of guesswork. And what I've discovered is that GIS is both helpful and unhelpful for that type of work. It's unhelpful in that you have to make decisions that you're not sure about and just go with them. But it is helpful in that as soon as you start to take it out of an imaginative space and you force yourself to go with what the logical conclusion is, you can start to see patterns. So I uncovered a community of people, not just jongleurs, who continue to interact with each other in this specific area. And that has told me more about the individuals behind these property records than I could have known if I hadn't been able to visualize on the map and understand that they are a close-knit community of people living right next to each other. And to sort of bring this back around to the question of why are there no jongleurs on the Rue de Jongleur, I think that this is also a problem. You know, we have GIS and its problems, we have interpretation and historical evidence, but then we have the survivorship bias. So the evidence that's giving us these records are actually the archives of the people who owned these churches, which is a specific religious order. So obviously their archives favor the area near them. So what we have here is sort of a blind spot. And it's unclear if that blind spot is a reality or just a reality of the sources that we have. So going forward, sort of envisioning what might be in that blind spot, searching the archives that aren't owned by this church for property records of jongleurs is kind of where I want to take my project next. As for the map, since so much of it is interpretive and so much of it sort of doesn't give you anything to hold on to, and we can't be sure that X person lived exactly, you know, in this space. One of the things I've done is actually create images for every document that I have on the map. So for every document, every point that you see on the map, I have also created this image, which allows you to see how the document describes the layout of property. Since those buildings no longer exist, I can't show it on the map without drawing all the buildings, which I haven't done, but I can show this sort of layout and maybe give people a better understanding of precisely how these properties are interacting beyond just being sort of individual points, being able to see that this jongleur is neighbors with, Ortolanus means gardener. And again, kind of just helping people visualize what is actually really abstract and obscure data from the past, particularly as a medieval historian. I think being able to envision the real space helps us envision the reality of these people's lives. And in this particular instance, seeing the proximity of these spaces helps us also envision the proximity of the people and what it means that we encounter them, in all these documents that place them next to each other, witnessing each other's marriages, being executors of each other's wills, etc. All of which we find just through property records. So I think that ultimately this map is a map of community, and I hope to kind of expand it as I move forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. Next up today, we have Florencia Pech, who's a doctoral candidate in the Natural Resources and Science Management program. Her MnDRIVE thematic area was the environment, and her presentation is entitled Linking Tech with Western Ecological Knowledge to Understand Forest Management and Governance in Maya Communities.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you see my screen?
We are seeing your desktop at the moment, Flora.
Okay, I'm just going back to the slideshow. So I'm just going to turn off my video because I'm going to be moving a little bit while I'm talking. Okay, so this research is part of my doctoral dissertation, where I explore the human and environmental impacts of handicraft production driven by the tourism market at Chichen Itza, Yucatan, Mexico. And I analyze how these impacts are influencing genders, livelihoods, and natural resource management of nearby Maya communities. Okay. Maya artisans obtain the wood of Bursera simaruba, which is a local tree, locally known in Maya language as chaca, to carve handicrafts from community-owned forests. After almost a half-century of chaca extraction in community forests, there remains no empirical data about the situation of Bursera simaruba's population in community forests. Likewise, little attention has been paid to the indigenous ecological knowledge, which is the IKI, of Bursera simaruba for handicraft production. Indigenous ecological knowledge is also called or known as traditional ecological knowledge, or TIC, in academic literature, and refers to the local and indigenous knowledge about the natural environment, such as forests, water, animals, etc. Uses empirical data is important to science in general. Integrating indigenous ecological knowledge is important in natural resources and sustainability sciences because it allows us to understand from an indigenous perspective the importance of their natural resources. So part of my research for the human in the data, I wanted to deep more into the local understanding of the forest and the different elements of the forest for Maya communities. I'm using mainly literature that has been published by Maya authors that have been working on the understanding of the natural elements of the forest in the Yucatan Peninsula. So one of the authors that I was dipping more into was Ana Rosa Duarte. She's a Maya scholar who has written about the importance of the forest, which is known as cash in the Maya language, and how the understanding of the cash from the knowledge of Maya campesinos or Maya farmers it really means more than when we do a translation to whether the Spanish or the English. So I think keeping these words with their original language in Maya is something that I hadn't considered before. And when I got into this literature, I became, to realize that how important it is for me to keep these words as they are in the Maya language. So that's why in part why my title is From Cache to Chichen Itza. So today's rural Maya people practice self-subsistence autonomies in their communities as part of their everyday life in the milpa, in the gathering of wood in the forest, in the hunting, in Maya ceremonies, and in the production of honey, in the raising of domestic animals. And even when they are participating in contemporary employment opportunities within the cash economy, such as handicraft production, these opportunities go towards self-subsistence autonomies, given that their incomes in turn sustain their families and communities' self-subsistence practices. So something that's very important, and I feel it's worthy to bring to this presentation today, is these three different concepts of Maya territorialidad, or territory and land, which is the cash, the call, and the car. And I will talk a little bit about these three concepts. So these three concepts, cash, and call, include physical and metaphysical, cultural and social elements, which get lost with translation. So for instance, the cash encompasses the physical components of the forest, such as plants, animals, cenotes, caves, soil, rocks, etc. And also the metaphysical components, such as the Yumsilov, which are the spirits associated to the forest, the luces, malvientos, etc. And the cultural components, such as the stories, practices, and knowledges about the forest, physical and metaphysical elements, and the intimate relationship among those and the Kaj. With the Kaj is like this social space, like the community, not just the physical space where the community is settled, but also this social space for inhabitants to gather with each other and to have like these social networks and these social connections. Additionally, in the collective memory, the cache means a place of resistance against colonization and dispossession, making the forest an important element of the historical and social cultural context of Maya people. So we have the forest not just from one environment, from the environmental perspective, but also it's an important place from a historical and social perspective. The social components are part of the institutions, rules, and practices associated with the use, management, and responsibilities every member has in the CAG in regard to the forest. So this is just one example of all the different elements that are lost when CAG is translated as monte in Spanish or forest in English. So this also happens with the concepts of CAG and call. So I was really getting, deep in my knowledge, during this summer about these different conceptions, right, of the forest, of the community, and of the call, which is the milpa, or the traditional agricultural system that we can see in the picture over here. So why I was exploring this. So part of my chapter is exploring the empirical data that I have, the ecological data of, Bursera simaruga in the forest. But when I was doing an analysis of this empirical data, with this statistical analysis, I found out that milpa, or the call, it was a very important thing that was telling me, or it was attached to the density or the abundance of this tree in the forest. But at the same time, this abundance was attached to the management of that forest, which was in the form of the milpa. So I was looking, all these different management types that my farmers do to the forest. And this has a connection with this handicraft production that we have not seen before. So for me, that was like, okay, I need to know more, about these concepts, and I need to get more deep with the literature and have, all those other meanings that maybe I'm missing because I'm just focusing in one perspective, the pure ecological perspective. So, okay. Yeah, so these are just some more pictures about, the milpa and the different landscapes that you can see in Maya communities. And as part of my products of things I was working during the Humanity Data Fellowship. Is this is still work in progress, but it's having this story map as a way, to show this visual, and also like a way for me to, put all this knowledge and the importance, highlighting the importance, of this ecological knowledge of Purceras in Maruba, and also this relationship with forest and milpa and how that links to handicraft production. So this is just like, as I say, it's working in progress. But I think, as Catherine, I'm just going to echo what Catherine said, it takes more time than you think. And it's important, to consider that. And I just want to finish, showing a map of the region. So I think that this was something I was working, having these different plots where so this is just like a little map that shows the different plots where I collected, vegetation data and how these different type of vegetations. In the future, I'm thinking, to have the attachment of the milpa and the different management of the forest in this map. Okay. And with that, this is just a little example of my thematic analysis and in vivo. The milpa, I just like these visuals. And just want to say thank you, HDO's Boutique, thank you everybody, to the fellowship, and also to Michael, because I think he was very helpful, to guiding me through my in vivo and through everything, but also to all the fellows for their support and community this last summer, and finally to my committee members, Kristen, Mike, Janet, Gabby, and Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you, Florencia. Appreciate it. Next up, we have Isaac Esposto, a doctoral student in the Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies Department. Their MnDRIVE thematic areas were robotics and environment, and their presentation is entitled Algorithms and Architectures of Borderland Confinement, a technopoetic palimpsestic history of the US-Mexico border. And I apologize, Isaac, for butchering that. I'll turn it over to you.
No, that's definitely a word. The palimpsestic is like not an easy crossword word. First of all, Opuentalish, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here today. I'm recording, or not recording, but coming to you live from the traditional and rightful lands of the Tohono O'odham and the Pascua Yaqui. So again, thank you. I ended up creating an ArcGIS story map as well, which I pre-recorded a little tour for that we're going to go through, which was a combination of both archival work and my field work with the humanitarian aid group, No Mas Muertes. So I will start sharing my screen. Got this. All right. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop for a second because I cannot remember if I clicked the share sound box. I did not. Okay. The one thing I had to do. Okay, let's get into it.
Hi all, again. So here's a little bit of the preview of my project. With the help of the Human in the Data Fellowship and all their amazing support, I created this ArcGIS story map that is titled The Algorithms and Architecture of Borderland Confinement, a techno-poetic palimpsestic history of the US-Mexico border. So in this multimedia ArcGIS story map, I aim to create a living archive to track the history of data analysis as a form of state-sanctioned violence, specifically as it is foundational to understanding what is at stake as these so-called smart technologies become more normalized, tumbling from the border and into the US interior. And in addition to tracking these manifestations of the material and the virtual, I'm interested in how these algorithms and architectures can be disrupted. Pulling from my community during my time completing my MFA in poetry at the University of Arizona, I've also compiled here a series of interviews and works from border artists that aim to repurpose data through artistic intervention. This story map draws on the relational potential of the digital to offer new ways of exploring poetry and performance as their own forms of algorithms, ones that we can rewrite and revise in the face of abstracted border technological violence. So, to start off though, I wanted to take almost a step back, or a scan out. In my first section, I've included an interactive scrolling map that highlights the omnipresence of border violence, as you can see here. Even if we think the border is physically very distant from our everyday life, this map on the left, for example, shows the southern locations of current active Border Patrol checkpoints, which maybe we don't necessarily move through each day. But on the right here, I also wanted to show this graphic created by the ACLU, which highlights the actual range of Customs and Border Patrol jurisdiction. As this graphic reminds us, Custom and Border Patrol expansively defines the border zone as any location that is 100 miles from a U.S. land or coastal border, a space where nearly 2 out of 3 people in the United States live. And I think it's really important to keep the understanding of these technologies are not just in one geographical location, but something spread across the United States as a whole. They're very continuous circuits. And of course, this is a longer story. It is necessary to ground data collection systems in their colonial logic specifically. My next section then provides a series of historical flashpoints that can be used to mark the development of carceral projects within the Sonoran Desert. Here we can follow first the Spanish, then Mexican, and currently the U.S. occupation of Tono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui lands. So during this summer fellowship, I spent time in the University of Arizona's Architectural Special Collections Archive, following the development of architecture in southern Arizona that was central to this project of settler colonialism and nation-state building. For example, this timeline follows the spread of these architectures of confinement, such as the Spanish mission systems, colonial and contemporary military bases, reservations, land privatizations, allotment, carceral institutions such as work farms, and of course the border wall itself. And what I wish to emphasize through this timeline is that settler colonial borders and their supporting infrastructures are essential to this understanding of how data collection and data surveillance at the border continues to crash through indigenous lands and have been central to the ongoing story of border violence itself. But now I also want us to zoom in to one of the most iconic manifestations of border architecture, the wall. This is an ArcGIS map here that kind of deconstructs that imaginary understanding of the wall as an unending monolith. However, in actuality, there are many gaps, and as you can see here in this map, if you zoom in, the wall is actually composed of a different series of stops and gaps, barbed wire and vehicular barriers. There are also some places where there's nothing at all. In this section, what I've created on this accompanying map down here, down in these graphics, for example, are the things that are on both sides of the gaps. So one gap in particular I'd like to highlight is a fairly recent one we can see here, Doug Ducey's shipping wall container, I have called it. In October 2022, then Republican Arizona Governor Doug Ducey ordered a multi-ton shipping container to be stacked along the border in the Coronado National Forest as a form of makeshift border wall. It has since been taken down because of its illegality, basically. And so now here we are as the wall and other sites of border confinement become this endoskeleton for data collection, the catalytic collision between territory, identity, structure, and movement. Architecture at the southern border, such as walls, checkpoints, detention centers, in addition to data collection technologies such as drones, automatic license plate scanners, and remote surveillance systems, are used to separate people into territories of access versus territories of exclusion through these apparatuses of racial profiling. Architecture and design such as one-way mirrors and facial recognition scanning at checkpoints are ubiquitous features at along the US-Mexico border that facilitates surveillance and possible apprehension by US Customs and Border Patrol agents. So in this section, I take a deeper look into these data and biometric collection systems, in addition to a couple creative interventions, artistic interventions, such as poems and video montages of the checkpoints themselves. And I know I'm running a little low on time as I get into this. And so I want to think about, of course, this all comes with a death toll, as increasingly significant portions of the wall is virtual. These networks of surveillance cameras, sensors, and radar systems let Border Patrol agents from California to Texas monitor these remote deserts and stretches where border crossers have intentionally been funneled, resulting in hundreds of deaths. 748 migrants lost their lives crossing the US-Mexico borderlands last year. And I didn't want to leave this project in a place on the finality of border violence. And so while border surveillance is a very real reality, I also desired this project to show the pursuit, or to show the creative ways people resist informatics and this pursuit of data at all stakes that has been part of the surveillance systems in the borderlands, of which the predictive methods reformulate the world and how we interpret it in the name of optimization. So in this last section, I close with a series of these artistic attempts to destabilize proper forms of documentation, for example, highlighting their erasures, gaps, and interventions. And so I believe by centering these ongoing interventions by border artists, we can repurpose algorithms through poetic and performative interventions for liberatory purposes. Holding each other as we work through these counter-surveillances artworks, we can start to think through the nuances of establishing community agency and resistance within these treacherous spaces of informational technologies. And these are a couple dear friends I have who have very generously spoken with me and provided access to their work. So, Awe, thank you.
Great, thank you, Isaac. We will now turn to our final presentation in our first group of presenters here. And I introduce to you Kadir Yavuz Emdiroglu, a doctoral student in the anthropology department. The MnDRIVE thematic area of their work has been the environment. And the presentation from Kadir is Stories as Data, Understanding a Regime and a City via Human Accounts. Kadir?
Hello, everyone. Can you see my presentation right now, or?
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. Hello, I am Kadir, an anthropology PhD student working on Ankara, the capital city of Turkey, and working to understand human experience of the city that is impacted by an authoritarian regime. So this research was made possible in the summer with the support of the Human in the Data Fellowship and the institutions that supported that fellowship. And I'm very much grateful, but this presentation will be a presentation of a partial failure and inability to account for human experiences. And I will explain why. But first of all, let me kind of tell you where I'm coming from in terms of the data part of this story. So I am working on cities and the built environment, and the nice and really cursed part of this is city space gives us so much data. It gives us architectural history, it gives us this material presences, it gives us humans, their conversations, their bodily existences, even their medical histories sometimes. The way state is present in this space is also gives us a bunch of data, how the police is stationed, how there are certain violent events are taking the frequency of them, the economic exchanges happening in the city spaces, etc., etc. It is almost maddening, especially for researchers who are trying to write dissertations. But this is a good thing, right? But then with the human and the data context of things, the question becomes not just the finding the data in the city space, but rather how to spot the human in the data, right? So how to spot the human in the city space. In my dissertation and in the research I did in the summer and in the following months in Turkey for my fieldwork, I tried to interweave ethnographic observation with mapping and ethnographic drawing. So I try to draw human moments, human objects, but the main thing I did to spot the human in the data was this benches. It doesn't have to be this bench or this material form of the bench, but to spot the human in the data, I simply sat on a bench and waited for a human to happen to me, to sit beside me or stand near me, and simply waited for interaction between ourselves, because this is rather interesting to be in a city space as an ethnographer. You don't always have chances to introduce yourself as an ethnographer and ask questions suddenly. And that helped me a lot in terms of finding connections and stories. And that I will show the next slide, but this was a really good thing for me. And this has been a good thing for me as an ethnographer until the question changed again recently. So as you might have heard 2 weeks ago in Turkey and Syria, a series of earthquakes happened and took lives of tens of thousands of people, and also non-human lives. And the question for me became what to do when our cities and fellow human beings are under the rubble. So I try to see the built environment, the city space, the street, the bench, and the humans around them and within them. But what happens when the city collapses on us, onto the social, cultural life we have been trying to live despite the authoritarian regime, despite the interventions by any self-righteous pro-regime element? What happens when you just can observe the rubble and you are pretty much numbed as an observer? And the answer I got to this question is, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to say something at this point. And this is the failure or the inability part of my research. It is partly due to how new everything is. Maybe I will find a way to articulate some of the observations I was able to gather, but there is something more to this inability to say something about what's happening in Turkish cities that are quite impacted by earthquakes, but also the regime's interesting ways of governing the earthquake and not prioritizing human lives in those governance decisions. But I still want to say some stuff about stories in city spaces. So when cities are not in ruins, I mean, when they are functioning ruins, that does not prevent life, human or non-human. The built environment makes us tell stories, simple ones, simply human ones. This presentation is a story that the built environment in Ankara made me tell, in Turkey made me tell. But these stories are rather important because they help you to make sense of that abundance of data I tried to articulate by drawing a crowded street or talking about different categories of data sets. And I want you to meet Basri Amca. I didn't draw Basri Amca, but the bench was quite the medium. I was able to meet him. And he approached me to ask me for money because he needed the money for his granddaughters, he said. And in our conversation that followed that, he shared 3 sentences that was quite a story. And he said, I used to sell produce by traveling Ankara with my horse cart. Mr. Erdogan, the president, banned the horse cart. And now I'm walking around the city to ask help for my grandkids. Quite a simple story, quite a simple, grammatically sensible 3 sentences. but the way he interweaves mobility, the question of regime's involvement. I'm sure that the president was not directly involved in banning horse carts in Turkey, but the way he chose those words and he chose those figures made sense to me as an observer of the city space and the regime. And that story was very much more vocal than any book or dissertation I could write. But still, I don't know what to say, because even the story Basri Amjad told me is now under the rubble, theoretically, because he's living in Ankara, probably not impacted by the earthquake. But the way earthquake happened and governed by the regime made me unable to say stuff about built environment in Turkey currently. And my point will be maybe a lazy point, but maybe that's the story about built and ruined environments in Turkey right now. The way even this earthquake created a bunch of data sets about the rubble, about how buildings collapse, etc. But the real data, the real story is an ethnographer being unable to say something about the human experience there. Lastly, I want you to look up two things. I'm sorry, I'm acting like a teacher, but I'm in the fieldwork, so I missed acting like a teacher. The first one is a poem by Alden Nolan. It's called Broadcaster's Poem. It's about being unable to talk about stuff in the radio while you don't know where your voice goes to. It can go to really bad places, but the poem is beautiful and it tells much more than I could tell in the presentation. And secondly, there's a QR code, but also you can Google Turkish philanthropy funds. You will find a donation link for the recent earthquake victims. It's not an imposition, but I just felt quite compelled to share this with you since I wasn't able to tell you a sensible or a story that made sense. Thank you. Thanks to the Human in the Data Fellowship and the institutions that we're part of, and I'm very much grateful for your time and for this chance to speak about my research. Thank you.
Thank you, Kadir. And thank you to Catherine, Florencia, Isaac, and Kadir for this excellent set of opening presentations. If all four of you would please keep your video and sound, or your video unmuted and then sound unmuted as requires, and join me on screen. We now have some opportunity to engage in dialogue with our four presenters. And so if there are questions from the audience or from your fellows on your work or your progress, the thoughts and reflections on the content of these presentations would also be welcome. So I will stop talking and see if there are any questions from the audience.
We do have a question from the audience from Shana Crossan. For Catherine, I'm intrigued by your thoughts about the limitations of GIS in doing the type of historical research you are doing. What are your thoughts about what could make mapping and GIS more helpful in this space? Would you recommend that other historians try mapping their research?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say I definitely recommend that other historians at least try mapping. And part of that is because I think at least by starting to do some of the mapping, the map forced me to ask questions that I did not realize I should be asking. So not even for finding answers always, but sometimes the attempt to map can force you into new questions and new things to query. I think the difficulty of the mapping and what may help, there's maybe a level of some uncertainty to historical mapping of things that no longer exist that GIS just doesn't currently allow for. And that has been a big hurdle for me. Like I said in my presentation, it's productive to force yourself to decide on a conclusion and see where that road leads. But for a more accurate, for lack of a better word, for a more accurate map, it would be helpful to be able to build uncertainty in, to have a point that could be labeled as a single item, but could be visually represented as existing potentially in multiple places. I think that's well, that, and then there's also the problem that GIS is not always friendly to adjusting features that that it considers stable. The street names, you know, other things like that you want to change when you're doing something historically, or even just lines of streets, without geo-rectifying a map that, you know, in the 12th century just doesn't really exist. This is a thing I didn't say, but I think something I would want to do going forward is, there's another historian who has drawn quite a good map, and I think that would potentially be a better base map that I could geo-rectify without too much trouble. But yeah, those are my thoughts on that. Thank you, Shauna.
Thank you, Catherine. We have another question by Susanna Smith. I have similar question to Shayna's. For those of you who are using story maps, I can see how visualizing your project data can be really productive. Can you comment on how this received in your discipline? I guess several of you could answer that.
Do you want to start, Isaac? Because yours was very well like, finished. Mine is still like working in progress, but I can, you know, add a little bit after you. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. I think it was, I mean, so much of my field work down in Arizona along the border is like hiking to these very remote places. And there's something about like the Sonoran Desert specifically, where having that like visual grounding felt very important to this story. I'm in gender, women, sexuality studies. So I think the way in which feminist knowledge production thinks about, you know, what we're doing is all telling stories. And it was just like a very helpful tool to be able to both place like the archive, the places I was finding in the archive, these like the bones of colonial confinement and the structures, and place them like literally in a visual place that I can go to and look at. And that's what I was kind of trying to work with the palimpsestic history. So much about settler colonialism is based on this like amnesia, this like eraser of indigenous ways of being and onto epistemologies, and ossifying the settler as like that end all be all that will ever be. And so I think having that layered component between both like the physical, the material, and the virtual through the images was just one very generative tool to help kind of like give that palimpsestic layering. A palimpsest is a piece of paper that, or any sort of medium that has been erased and then written on it again, and then erased and written on it again, but you can still kind of see the layers beneath it. So yeah, I was super excited about getting to use those visuals through the ArcGIS story map, and I will pass it.
Yeah, I think for me, like in my discipline, you know, I think that's a very interesting question, you know, how is this receiving your discipline? For me, this is part of like the work I'm doing outside of, you know, my kind of academic products. Like, I feel like having this story map, it's going to get, you know, more accessible, the information that I have, you know, that I'm reading in my dissertation, at least for this chapter. And especially I choose this story map to bring, you know, that indigenous ecological knowledge on, you know, the Chacao, Burseras, Maruba, and handicraft production, because I feel that's making that as visual, you know, and also like using like simple sentences, simple, you know, paragraphs. And I also want to have this story map also like a version in Spanish, you know, just to make it more accessible to more, you know, other people that might be interested. And also like, I'm thinking, you know, like making it accessible, you know, to the indigenous communities I'm working with. And then I think about like many of these communities don't have, you know, internet access. So like that just makes me, you know, like by doing this, it's like what I have to also to think, you know, it makes me think of other things, you know, like more uncovering more ways, that I need also to work on getting my research in different ways for other communities. But I think just having, like the story map, it's good for, at least for my own purpose, to having my thoughts, like structure, and also having the visuals. It helps me to build my research into like a history. And I think that's really, really cool, to see your research in a different way. Yeah.
Excellent. Are there any questions? I see there are a few questions here in the Q&A thing. Are there any questions from the audience that I'm missing raised hands on?
I think Ida has some questions too.
Yes, I see some of Aiden's. Kate, I saw your hand. We'll go to Kate, and then we'll see if we'll pick on one of Aiden's questions here.
Yeah, so actually my question tags on to what Florencia was just saying about internet access, which is, and this is coming from someone whose project was also focused on a story map, but 3 of you did story maps, and I think all of you are really working with kind of people on the outskirts, people on the margins, and there are many benefits to using a story map to visualize data that is otherwise really challenging to see, but then it's living online, it's living on a computer, you need to have like technological access. So I was wondering how you are all negotiating the tensions of, this is a great way to like bring together all these pieces of data and like visualize humans in a different way, but at the same time, it's a particular type of medium that's potentially more challenging to bring back to these communities or share with others.
I don't mind going first because I suspect I have the least to say about this. It's a good question. Partially, it's one that I haven't thought of a lot, and that's probably because I take for granted that there are a lot of people in general who just don't care, just because it's so specific. And actually, something that I'm finding, and when I say people in general, I mean people outside the academy, aren't necessarily even thinking that sex work exists in the 12th century. I think another thing that I find, at least with dealing with sex work, is I am far more concerned about teaching the academy to learn from sex workers than about presenting my findings to sex workers, if that makes sense. And I don't think that's not coming from any place of like false humility or altruism. That's coming more from a place of, I think that the academy is really good at theorizing things and not always good at stopping and hearing about what the practical questions and challenges are. And I think when you're talking about 12th century sex work, like I am to a great degree, I always want to make sure that I'm stopping and centering voices of the people who exist today, and the marginalized group that exists today, that is in some ways the subject of what I'm studying, but in many ways not. So I feel a lot of responsibility to past people, but I feel more responsibility to present people. And I think that I haven't thought so much, and to be clear, I think that I should think more about your question, but I haven't thought so much about how to disseminate my knowledge to those modern groups, because I'm focusing so heavily on how to bring their knowledge into the space of the academy that does not make space for it very often, particularly in historical studies, where a lot of people occasionally privilege some sense of past, rigor of the past over sort of modern moral and political implications. Maybe I have more to say on that than I thought.
Laura, Isaac, Kadir, any of you want to chime in on that question?
Yeah, this is such a good question, but I talked a lot, so if anyone else wants to jump in, otherwise I'm happy to. I guess, oh, no, go for it, go for it.
It's fine. You have your thoughts there already. So go ahead.
I guess really shortly thinking about technology and accessibility and who we're accountable for with a thing like a story map, I think about like specifically where I live along the US-Mexico border, and the fact that like these systems of surveillance and data collection are gonna exist no matter what. And so having just even like attempts at disrupting them, or attempts at like, you know, knowing your enemy better, like BP is like funded with millions and millions of dollars for technology and data surveillance. And so I think any sort of attempt to disrupt or like monkey wrench into those systems of surveillance and data collection for their own sake is important in just getting like the muscle practice of moving towards liberated spaces of no borders or the end of settler colonial police states. So I'm not sure if there's like an ever like end point to this project, but it's just kind of like the practice of doing it.
I can just add, you know, a little bit to that, but yeah, it's a really good question. And I kind of like was a little aware, you know, that like maybe this is not intended, you know, for those communities, but it's like, I know it's important to have it there because other groups or other stakeholders can look at this, and it can be helpful, you know, and somehow to bring also some resources or help, you know, or some way in the future, this will have an impact maybe to, you know, kind of like connect people, you know, with the handicraft producers. So I was also planning to do like a community event, you know, in order to bring, you know, keep these relationships and also not show, but kind of like just have, you know, reconnect with people in the communities. So I did travel to Mexico, but, you know, with the COVID pandemic, and we were back and forth with the community. I was back and forth with communities, and we decided like, no, it was not time yet, because even when the pandemics, you know, here might be a little bit more kind of like subtle, there is still a big problem, especially in rural communities that are very far, you know, from hospitals, that they don't have clinics and things like that. So we decided to, you know, wait on that. But I'm still thinking in ways, you know, that I can go back, connect to the communities, and give back in some ways, you know, because there are more than one way to give back to the communities. So I am also thinking, you know, on this space, putting this on the web is also a way to maybe find future connections that will help me to bring back future support to the communities. Yeah, that's only some of my thoughts on that.
Thank you all.
Great. Yeah, thank you all for those thoughtful responses. We've got a couple more questions, but we don't have time at the moment. So we'll sidebar those. I think Valeria's question will be excellent to address maybe in the next Q&A session as well. And again, thank you all of our first group presenters. We're now going to transition to our second four fellows. And beginning our next stage here is Aidan Nair, a doctoral student in the biostatistics program in the School of Public Health. His MnDRIVE thematic area was the environment, and the presentation to be presented here is aquatic invasive species and Twitter, an exploratory data analysis. Aidan.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate the introduction and just the MnDRIVE Human in the Data Fellowship for being able to do this work. Yeah, I got to pull up my slideshow here. And just to start, welcome to my presentation on aquatic invasive species and Twitter and exploratory data analysis. I'm Aidan, and I'm part of the biostatistics department. And an overview of the presentation is just kind of the why behind the project, what's the motivation here, and then going into exploratory data analysis and findings, and a discussion of learnings, and then get into some acknowledgements. As far as the motivation for the project goes, so I submitted, like Michael said, under the environment category, and the Minnesota economy is quite reliant on the environment, in part the healthy aquatic ecosystems that we can take for granted, and AIS threaten the health of them, and in that the economy, a lot of the conservation efforts too are supported around our aquatic ecosystems. So fishing licenses, for example, are the largest source of revenue for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Game and Fish Fund, at least as of 2020. So it's a pretty important and big problem. And that said, data is hard to come by on AIS, both on adaptive governance, which is the collaboration between state and non-state actors across multiple levels. So from the county level to the state level to the federal level. And then also on just the ecology of the animals or plant species. And then lastly, Twitter data in and of itself has shown promise for solving public health problems. For example, there's a system that in New York City predicts foodborne illness outbreaks by mining Twitter data. So that those kind of three items motivated my curiosity around aquatic invasive species and Twitter. And so the first step in this is accessing the Twitter API or application programming interface. So just kind of how I can make requests and obtain data. It's available at no cost to graduate students or scholars. It does require an application. Note, I've made the contents of my application as well as kind of a brief overview of all of the R code that I used for this project. So if anybody, and it's freely available to anybody to use. So if anybody is wanting to do anything similar on a different topic, they can feel free to access that information at the link provided, and I can drop that in the chat as well. And what I did is I took kind of a tweet-centric approach. So I queried for certain hashtags that were made of these different keywords. So there are 4 topics: invasive species, aquatic invasive species, aquatic nuisance species, and then different animal and plant species. For those, I obtained those by scraping the Minnesota DNR website, which just is a word for like automatically extracting that information. And the R code for that too is also in the GitHub profile. But that resulted in total 5,385 tweets over a 10-year period in the US. In my analysis, I wanted to first assess kind of the abundance or the number of tweets. And I broke that down temporally or across time, and then geospatially, so across space. And interestingly enough, it seems like the AIS-related tweeting is in decline, which is not a good sign for expanding upon this work, but was an early finding with a couple of peaks around 2014 and 2018. And then also I noticed in my sample, there's a lot of hashtag goldfish, hashtag invasive species. And as I'll talk about later, that can cause kind of problems with any firm conclusions from these analyses. So I also wanted to just kind of provide insight into kind of the iterative process that I went through. So one of the goals of exploratory data analysis is to identify and remove outliers or deal with them in some way. And when I was plotting the geotagged information, there was this kind of just weird dot off in the middle of the ocean, which I'm assuming they weren't tweeting off in the middle of the ocean. So remove that, and then could focus more in on the tweets of interest. So in the far right, I excluded the goldfish, which again, I'll talk about further. And I also did a social network analysis. So on the left, we see that there's, so what I did in this is I've got the AIS tweet authors, which is about 220 tweets total, and who authored them, and then their followers and their followings. And on the left, this author, the city of Durham, North Carolina, dominated the social network in terms of these different metrics. And so I kind of removed this social network outlier and then realized that there's these two additional communities that emerge of authors, and it's hard to see on the slides, but there is a connection between them. So there's a user that kind of has ties to both communities. And then I got into more analyzing the content itself. So on the left is just a word cloud. So the larger the word, the more common it was in those 210 tweets. And then on the right, it's a sentiment analysis. So the different words or concepts are bucketed into these 8 different emotions. And what the x-axis is showing us is just kind of the average amount of that sentiment present in the average tweet in that sample. And so, like disgust and anger were kind of, to me at least, surprisingly lowly represented in the sample. And then lastly, I did a qualitative analysis on engaging tweets and authors. So those that had high like retweets and quotes and likes as far as the tweets goes, and then the authors, those that had high representation in the social network analysis metrics. So in that, it revealed some data quality issues in the goldfish tweets. So the snack that smiles back and like swimming was represented, as well as koi, like pet koi. And then there in the invasive species tweets, there's kind of this sense of threat as a theme in these engaging tweets, as well as an overlap with aquatic invasive species. And fishing, as well as an educational theme, emerged in the rest of these highly engaging tweets. And then lastly, these eco-influencer individuals and institutions kind of emerged from the influential author analysis, just looking at the descriptions of them, like avid photographer, there's like a poet represented and ecologist represented, as well as the city and these different institutes focused around research. Discussion of learnings. So here, just more scientifically, the identification of influential tweet and authors in this context or in other contexts might inform outreach or a better understanding of the collaboration between these entities. About the decreasing rate of AIS tweet production, at least, kind of challenges any like meaningful connection to the ecology and the lake infestation as a challenge. And then lastly, I'm thankful for the opportunity to have explored some of the humanistic implications. And just generally, as a human awash in data, it can be a little overwhelming to try to navigate, as I'm sure other fellows kind of share that sentiment. So there's some mental models that I came across, one of which is wabi-sabi, so a Japanese philosophy that just says there's beauty to be had in impermanence and imperfection. And I like to keep that front and center now in my data projects, because just, yeah, the first iteration is going to suck and it can get better after that. And then additionally, I kind of came up with this like framework of building a box, even that can move over time and change over time. Just that it's important to kind of constrain oneself to time and space of interest, as well as features. So when I say that, the data that you're going to work with, what kinds of analysis that you're going to do, and then lastly, to share early and often, because as I've just been the theme, it's an iterative process and more feedback is good feedback. And lastly, thank you to the MnDRIVE program for funding this work, and then my mentors and family and friends.
Excellent. Thank you, Aiden. Thank you for sharing. Next up, we will be turning to Kate Bruns, doctoral student in the Communication Studies Department. studying the MnDRIVE thematic areas of global food ventures and the environment, with a presentation entitled Palo Cortado, an evolution of a dissertation. Kate.
Thanks, Michael. Let's just get this shared. All right, hopefully you can all see that. Seems like Aiden and I had similar slide template ideas. But thank you all for having me today. Again, my name is Kate Bruns. I'm a PhD candidate in the Communication Studies Department, studying environmental communication. And I'm really excited to be here today to share a little bit more about my experience with this Human in the Data Fellowship Program, including the original goal I had of creating a social network analysis using ArcGIS Story Map, how my summer fieldwork changed that goal, and then my kind of current state of and future plans for this project. So I wanted to start a little bit with sharing kind of the focus of my dissertation, which is wine and climate adaptation. So to kind of situate wine itself, wine has a really strong material and cultural value. We associate it with being a religious symbol, a medicinal cure, a beverage of status and ostentation enjoyed by the fancy. And the production of wine has led to the success of empires like Egypt and Greece, and the certification system used by wine has provided a template for other foods like cheese and olive oil. Wine production currently spans 6 continents, everywhere except Antarctica, and it's incredibly profitable. In 2019, wine production garnered $378.3 billion in global revenue. Wine is especially prolific in Spain, a country that boasts some of the oldest winemaking traditions in Western Europe and maintains the largest surface area of vineyards of any wine-producing nation, if you didn't know that. But of course, wine grapes are an agricultural product. So wine is really feeling the effects of a changing climate. Research currently projects that European nations, including Spain, will experience an average temperature increase of 2.5 to 5.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, as well as really large temperature fluctuations during the sensitive growing season of April to October. Now, these changes are affecting wine making throughout all of Spain, but it's especially threatening to the southern region of Andalusia. Andalusia is a prominent winemaking community on the southern peninsula of Spain by the Mediterranean Sea, and it's likely to experience increased thermal dryness and severe water stress in the forthcoming decades. Right now, community members are facing declining harvests, worsening grape quality, lots of lost money, and so the community is really kind of facing this difficult choice of either taking on expensive, kind of risky climate adaptation strategies, or basically doing things the way that they have for centuries until it straight up doesn't work anymore. Making those choices are really complicated, and they are affected by the many diverse interests within the community stakeholders, from the actual producers who make the wine, to the regulators who write and decide policies, to the journalists who actually report on these issues to the public. So the goal of my dissertation is basically to help us understand how climate adaptation is understood within these diverse stakeholder groups, to understand how climate adaptation in one hyper-local community is represented, negotiated, and decided. I've been working on this project for about 2 years. It started back in July of 2021 when I first visited Spain and kind of had this conversation with a community member, and that sparked the topic of my dissertation. Last spring, I was back in Spain doing some kind of early field work and informal interviews when I heard that I got one of the Human in the Data fellowships. And what I had pitched for that fellowship was essentially an opening chapter of my dissertation that would function as a social network analysis. I wanted to visually represent kind of key voices in Andalusia, key wineries, overlay climate data and geography and topographic maps and stuff to help understand basically what wine and climate knowledge looks like in that community. And so I was really excited to start this last summer. And in the middle of the summer, I had to leave for about 2 weeks because I was participating in a summer doctoral program that was coincidentally being held at a university in Andalusia. So I was like, I got to leave for a little bit, kind of get some feedback on my prospectus, do some preliminary fieldwork, and then I'll come back. So while I was in Spain at this doctoral program, I got a lot of excellent feedback. I was able to visit 3 wineries. So I got, photos and field data and stuff I was going to use in my map. Really excited. I also was able to kind of share the full plan for my dissertation with community stakeholders there. So I outlined, I'll start with the social network analysis, and then I'm going to do a media analysis and interviews. And I was thrilled because I ended up meeting a faculty member there who just coincidentally had been working in a winery for 10 years before he started in the communication department. Like, what are the odds? And so basically all these people were super jazzed. They're like, this is a great project. We're so glad that you're doing this, except you're doing a lot. They're like, this is a great idea, but we feel like you might need to scale it back a little bit to focus more on the humans. There was a lot of interest in the media analysis and the interviews that I was doing with winemakers, but the social network analysis and the story map, they're like, maybe that's something you do later, like as an article. And so this became a bit of a challenge for me. And the way that I've been reflecting on this is basically in the context of the title of my presentation, which is Palo Cortado. So I chose that title very intentionally because I think that that phrase represents my project's evolution throughout this program. I learned about Palo Cortado while I was actually in the field in Cádiz. Cádiz is part of Spain's Sherry Triangle, which is the only place in the world where a particular type of wine called sherry can be produced. The phrase Palo Cortado roughly translates from Spanish to English as broken stick. And that phrase is used to refer to a special type of sherry that's created when the wine fermentation process is naturally interrupted. Winemakers don't know what causes this interruption. They don't know when it's going to happen. But what this interruption does is it basically results in a completely unique small batch of sherry wine that cannot otherwise be replicated. So I think the Palo Cortado really speaks to how my plan for my fellowship was basically naturally interrupted and how it evolved. So I came in with this fellowship plan with an idea that was sparked by data, like wanting to bring together all this information and kind of represent it. But literally the humans within this data redirected this plan and said, we think that this is a great idea that you might want to like put a pin in, or maybe you can like redesign it in this other way. And they redirected it in a way that I could not have expected and didn't know what to do with. And that was really frustrating and really scary. But I think that it was for the best for this project. And I think that it has led to my dissertation going in a direction that's actually unique and better than I could have planned otherwise. So where is this project now? Well, I had the opportunity to go back to Spain to do a pilot study that was funded by Institute on the Environment this past November, where I spoke with more community members, and I'm currently going through those results. The social network analysis story map is still like a hopeful outcome of my project, but it's not quite there yet. It won't be an integrated chapter. So right now I'm doing more of the data analysis work, collecting all this information. I'll be returning to the field, hopefully in September, to do more interviews. But overall, having this opportunity over the summer to gain all these skills has been wonderful. I don't regret it, but now I'm in a different place. And so, thank you all for kind of listening to this story, and know that if your plans change beginning to end, that's okay.
The journey of a dissertation. Thank you so much, Kate, for sharing. We will now turn over to our penultimate presenter for today, Michael Valdez of the Theater, Arts, and Dance Department. With MnDRIVE thematic areas centering on global food ventures and the environment, Michael will be presenting Palestine in Your Parish, Church Performances and the Shaping of British Public Opinion on Middle East Expansionism, 1891 to 1917. Michael.
Hello, give me 1 second. Okay. Sorry about this. 2 seconds. Okay. Hi, like Michael said, my name is Michael Valdez. I'm a PhD candidate in the Theater Historiography Department with a split minor in Heritage Studies and Public History. So following that, my research centers around cultural history concerning public education through performance, or rather how information was dispersed and solidified to general populations through performances, exhibitions, displays. I'm really interested in the formation of formation of the public sphere and the sculpting of national and religious identities and subject positions, and the relationship therein to public policy historically. So I had the awesome opportunity to work with the Human in the Data Fellowship this summer, and it gave me the support and time to create some really useful maps in a visual aid alongside the first and second chapter of my dissertation, which are drafted and getting reviewed. So yeah, feeling really good about that. So the periodic meetings we had with the fellowship cohort also allowed me to workshop my ideas in progress and was a huge boon to the entire process. I do consider this a success since my goal was to produce these maps and draft the chapter, and I accomplished just that. So in short, my dissertation is focused on community performances and public education events that took place in England between 1891 and 1917. More specifically, it's an attempt to track down and categorize and label and describe the performances that were funded by the Church of England missionary societies to educate the current and potential members of the Christian Church about the Middle East, specifically the Levant region and Palestine. So the baffling image that I hope you're looking at, I hope you can see right now, is a 1906 cast photo, essentially, of one of the exhibitions where the volunteers and church members donned these allegedly educational costumes that showed what Arab and Palestinian populations really, quote unquote, looked like. You can see in the background a prop that was used, a pretty stereotypical teepee that was also used for an exhibition on Native Americans that toured through London. So this is kind of the onus of my project. Like, the representation of these indigenous populations had some clear slippage. And so when I was first getting into this project, I thought it would be important and interesting to track. So as of right now, there is no one collected archive of these performances, which were put on by the very specific missionary society called, and you can see at the bottom, the London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst Jewish People. Still doing business today as the Christian Ministry Among Jewish People, or the LSCJ. So the content of these performances was, pretty outright Orientalist, or in today's terminology. But a small group of pageant masters and performance makers would travel along railways to small parishes, deaneries, community centers, advertising the need for volunteers and participants. And so my overall dissertation is concerned with how information coming in from different groups, the Palestine Exploration Fund, the British Office for Foreign Affairs, missionary societies active in the Levant region, and these travel writers, was distorted, shaped, and then dispersed in performance through these arenas of public education. So the data part of this project is essentially a collection of quantitative data, demographics, ticket sales, space rental agreements, financial statements, maps, sales records, and there's also a qualitative data aspect, reviews, advertisements, diary entries, newspaper articles, and so forth. All of this gained from interviews, archival research done online and in person with the Royal Archives and the Church of England papers at Oxford. So I'm just going to move over to the GIS map that I had the opportunity of making. So it's a common trope in scholarship on these international exhibitions that these kind of these performances just kind of naturally arose from previously held notions and ideas of the Middle East. Ideas and tropes were dispersed by travel logs, histories of the Crusades, and through performance genres like Oriental comic opera, pantomimes, melodramas. So what bringing together this data allows me to do is show that some very specific and highly popular tropes were actually the result of a concerted effort by the Church of England and the British government, who are also funding land developments in the Levant region, the Palestine Exploration Fund, different kinds of survey efforts and power expansion in the region. And to cultural historiographers, this is an important distinction to make and an important development to track. So this study has the potential to describe the changing tactics that these powerful groups use to engage the public in specific notions of what the Middle East was, what it could be, and the general public subject position as British citizens in relation to the predominantly Arab other in what's widely considered the first wave of globalization. What the Human in the Data Fellowship Grant allowed for me to do is spend time developing some visual aids and maps to make this data legible. I had already been to the Church of England archives at Oxford to go over minutes and financial statements gathered from the missionary societies, but a lot of what I needed to create this archive, which was turned into these maps. Sorry, I'm trying to get my move away my sorry, my desktop is going a little nuts. So I turned them into the maps below. This unimpressive, but massively helpful maps, which now I use to keep my own process in order. Like this map has a map of my data points, images, links to other databases. It's very small on my screen. I wonder if it's larger on the screens that you can see. But reviews, dates, images, additional details of different performances. And this map below, let me see if I can zoom out a little bit. Of the performances, the kind of infrastructure that was at the beginning of the touring productions in 1891, and what it turned out to be by the end of its first run in 1917. All of these also have in my developer view links to other pieces of data, images, reviews to keep in line chronologically. List of participants and funders. I'm also giving a couple talks on the subject in the coming months. I have 2 conferences and invited talk, so I can show some changes over time. And below, which is a really interesting point of one of my chapters, which touring venues are connected either culturally or architecturally to the history of the Crusades. The fellowship also afforded me the time to conduct interviews with historians and archive managers still working on the Christian ministry among Jewish people, which is the Descendant organization. And as I'm still collecting data and doing interviews and waiting on other archives to get back to me with document requests, this is my kind of living map library. So in all, the Human and Data Fellowship afforded me the time and space to dwell in these disparate archival collections and databases with missionary societies in order to develop a clear and tangible touring schedule of these performances, map them, and thus make it easier to kind of attend to the changes and developments and how the Middle East was presented, how local communities were engaged, what tropes were kind of dispersed and solidified between the years of 1891 up until the British Mandate. So yeah, I'm very, very thankful for the Human and the Data Fellowship and the cohort members, because this was enormous help and it continues to be an enormous help.
Thank you, Michael. We are now going to switch to our final presentation of today. It is work by Pawan Sharma, who unfortunately was not able to join with us today, but has pre-recorded his thoughts and some production here. So Pawan Sharma is a doctoral student in the Asian and Middle Eastern Studies Department, The MnDRIVE thematic area that their work focused on was global food ventures, and the presentation you're about to see is entitled Food Memories in Transition, Construction of Identity and Invoking Food Cultures Through Sensory Interactions. Give me one moment to begin sharing Pawan's recording.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Pawan Sharma. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and I'm one of the fellows from last year's Human in the Data Fellowship. As a part of the Human in the Data Fellowship, I explored how food memories contribute to the migrant identities and the construction of collective memories amongst South Asian migrants in the Twin Cities. The focus of my research and artistic expression, because I have collected a few narratives during the course of the fellowship, and I created a short documentary out of it. So that's why I'm calling it my artistic expression as well. It both like my research and my work on visual narratives. I look at how South Asian migrants create home away from home by cooking, sharing, and consuming ethnic food. And by investigating the relationship between food and the memories it evokes, I examine the process of identity construction by redefining how it is rooted in certain social and cultural ideologies. Food being beyond a necessity for survival, it is also infused with powerful material and symbolic meanings. And the narratives which I collected, they provide an insight into what is the sensory mechanism that enables food to be remembered based on its material and symbolic meanings. Through this project, I specifically ask certain fundamental questions such as what symbolic significance does the memory of certain food have for a specific community? In any migrant community, what sensory agents recreate a sense of home or a sense of past? And can food constitute one of the most potent ways for ethnic, cultural, national, transnational, and above all, familial identities to be defined? What role does food play in alienation or assimilation between the communities? So with these certain questions, I have collected these narratives and I created this short documentary. Watching entire documentary is I'm assuming probably like beyond the scope of the duration of the presentation, but I have shared a short trailer of my documentary, which probably I'm assuming would be played after this video. And I'm really sorry that I could not attend the presentations in live. Otherwise, it would have been amazing to hear all the questions and being a part of the discussion about all the other projects and my project as well. And it would have been amazing to meet my fellow cohorts from the Human in the Data Fellowship. But I hope to reconnect with all of you sometime soon. And best of luck to the new applicants. And if you think my work is somehow relevant to you and you still have some questions and you would want to reach out to me, please do that. I would be happy to connect with anyone. And best of luck. Thank you.
My most fondest memories always involve food. Particularly, I've found a lot of community in Pan-Asian spaces, and in those spaces where we're building community across different Asian cultures. One of our favorite, essential ingredient to that community building, to that coalition building, for activism purposes is still food, is still connecting over food.
Like the festivals, any kind of festival, anywhere, not only mine, right? So any kind of festival will be surrounded with food. The food will be around everywhere. And the food will bring people to a certain area. Everyone gets together around the food, right? So food is really important, I believe. Even in my community, it's the same.
Yeah, if you go to a food street in Lahore, you would listen to all kinds of different sounds. Not just of people calling you to their food stalls, but also the sounds of the food. It's basically like a rhythm. You could even say music, tuck 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 tuck, and the person is just using these blades on the big pan, and then you hear that sound and you instantly have saliva in your mouth.
Thank Pawan for sharing that. And thank you to our second group here of fellows and their presentations. We'll now turn to our second period here of question and answer. And so if there is anyone in the audience, I invite the second round of presenters to join me in the spotlight section here and turn on their cameras. And we can see what questions the audience might have. Again, please either raise your Zoom hand and we will move to you, or use the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen.
Before anyone raises their hand, we can go back to Valeria's question for anybody to answer. For those who used GIS and mapping methods, was it clear to you at the moment of applying that you wanted to map your data as in using GIS or something like that? Or was this an aspect that came later as you started your fellowship?
Yes, please.
Yeah, it was kind of the main thing that I wanted to do with the human and the data, because I knew that I had this mass of quantitative and qualitative data that I was kind of figuring out how to put together into a tangible, legible thing. But it didn't occur to me until halfway through the summer, and then keeping, adding to it over the course of the semester exactly how useful it could be. Because it's always a challenge kind of making the qualitative and the quantitative talk to each other in a narrative format. And when I have this kind of visual aid helping me to track different changes over time, there are a couple of, I have like 6 maps because I'm still not too sure how to layer everything onto one map. And so I have, in my Esri account, there are different like temporal layers of when certain participants were funding certain exhibitions during 1891, 1892, 1893. And just to have that right at your fingertips to flick through is so extremely helpful, especially when you can hyperlink out. It was definitely a consideration going in, but just getting the time and space to, and the training that comes with the workshops in the fellowship, I had no idea how useful it would be going forward. And now I have like a great thing that I can throw up on the on like the conference screen, or when I go to do these talks, to really have a tool that makes everything really, really legible and really, really interactive. So yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I could go next in that. It's just I did not have a clear idea of how I was gonna like go about exploring my data, and one of my mentors just has emphasized to me the importance of breaking up like time and space, like one at a time. And so for me, just to like simplify my thinking about the different processes. So that's when I got more into the mapping component, and I'm thankful for the mentorship through the Human in the Data Fellowship, where we did have mapping experts come in and share some of their methods and ideas around that.
Yeah, I'll just add, I was a little bit like Aiden. Poor Michael, I was like, I have this idea of doing a social network analysis and I couldn't even articulate what I wanted to do. And so my time in the fellowship was like figuring out, okay, these are mapping options. This is how you do it. And so by the time I like got around to realizing how time consuming, as others have mentioned, it is to do the data collection and then put that in a map, the fellowship was kind of like already over, but it was a good learning experience.
Yeah, I just want to echo, it's a good learning experience to realize how long things can take just on all ends of the process.
I see a question here in the Q&A from Isaac that looks interesting. And so the comment here says, it's from Isaac, and he says, I'm interested in the comment about tracking the slippages in Michael's presentation. I was wondering how you saw that occurrence in the context of the data and how mapping complicated those historical slippages. I'm thinking of the example of the photo as a form of data and the visual representation of those Western ideas of education.
Yeah, that's a question that I'm continuing to kind of prod. I don't even know where to start with that. There's kind of just a truism that these were kind of, they were well funded by the Church of England, but they were essentially low budget, where the prop sets and costumes were kind of, if they had more than one application, then they were going to be used for more than one application. And what that essentially resulted in was, usually using visual markers that were to one indigenous population being used to educate about different indigenous populations. So there are, I see aspects of when people were, talking about, Aborigine, Native American, Arab, Bedouin, they were using the same kind of educational tools to educate through all these different populations to general public, which is, of course problematic, but I think extremely interesting. Props from the Wild West Bill Cody show were used kind of in the greater London area, but weren't so available when you kind of got out of that metropolitan area. So it's complicated, but I think that, using the maps to kind of figure out where the borders of these prop sets, costumes, different kind of dramaturgies were they used, were they used when you brought it to Scotland, or when you brought it to Ireland, or were they only used to educate, or to put on these presentations only around, the greater London area? And what I don't even know how to. What I'm really looking at right now is how the kind of temporalities of the Crusades and what was going on in 1891 and leading up to the, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, to the establishment of the British Mandate, like what kinds of educational tools and rhetoric were used, of like, are we at war, are we spreading Christianity, or are we kind of entering into like a global world where we're learning how to live with these Arab individuals or people who live in the Middle East that occupy the same the earth as us. And so what the mapping allows me to do is to kind of figure out, okay, what time and space were just certain rhetorics were used, certain scenes, costumes, and it continues to be complicated. I'm not sure if I answered your question at all, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about and how the visual aids are helping me think about it.
Thank you, Michael. We have another question from Janet Castellanos for Catherine. It would be interesting to see map the historical facts and changes you mentioned. For example, mapping where winemaking has taken place over time and know how this might be related to climate change. Would this be helpful for your project?
Yeah, that was absolutely one of the things that I was planning to do. And I think still something that I'd like to do moving forward. So when I think Shanna's here, I met with someone from uSpatial to kind of talk about like, what are some options of things that I could include in my map? And Shanna Crossan was really wonderful and said, you know, it might be interesting to do representations of like things around bodies of water, like rivers and oceans, and like see over time, like do wineries gravitate towards those sorts of water sources, or if there are floods or severe weather events. And I was like, yeah, that would be super cool. So absolutely, that's something I hope to do at a later time when I have defended.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious too, Kate, as far as the winemaking goes, like I'm sure in the future, obviously there are challenges that face winemakers today. Are there areas of the world that are going to become better at winemaking because of it?
Yeah, so like there are a lot of areas in like Western Europe, like the UK is now becoming a better winemaking area because it used to be like really wet and cold, and now it's warming up, and so now it's more ideal. Whereas places that were like the ideal levels of water scarcity are now becoming too water scarce or too hot and dry. So yeah, those are the shifts that we're starting to see. So it'd be really interesting to do kind of like a global map at some point, like way down the line in many decades. But yeah.
Cool.
Thank you, Catherine and Aiden, for continuing that conversation. We have one more question here on the Q&A from Shana. For those of you creating maps from your data, or in fact using any technology tool new to you, what kind of support would make it easier, more productive for you? Consults, courses, workshops, any other ideas?
I think so. For me personally, I used R, which depending on people's comfort level, like for that, there's a lot of blog articles and literally just going through the exercise of reproducing what somebody on a blog article did, like step by step by step, is super helpful for me to learn any new like method or use case of R. Outside of that, I know that there's a GIS like workshop, I think, that Shanna knows more about, and then the Human in the Data Fellowship, if you're fortunate enough to be a part of it, there's a lot of like mapping was a theme for a number of the workshops there.
Yeah, I'll do a shout out for the uSpatial like ArcGIS story mapping workshop. I think it was like 2 hours. I know a lot of us were in there, and like that was the first time where I was able to like get into a map and understand, okay, like I have 20 minutes to make a rough draft. Like how would I put together like Word content? How would I organize it? Like it was super, super helpful. It is more helpful if you already have the data with you. It is less helpful if you're like creating it from scratch, but yeah, shout out to that work.
Just to be fair, I did not ask that question in order to get shout outs. That was not the point. It was to just see what more types of things like that would be helpful for you. So.
Shauna, what is that workshop through uSpatial called?
It's a story maps. I'll go grab a link to the page that has the registration.
Thank you.
Another one in April, I think.
Well, I'm sure we could keep the conversation going, but I am going to take the opportunity now to thank all of the fellows for their wonderful presentations, for the good questions that got these conversations rolling here between the two sessions, and the excellent participation here from the audience and your fellows in talking to each other and thinking deeply about the excellent work you've produced over the past 8 months. It's been a pleasure working with you and very exciting to see sort of the fruition of the conversations we were having over the summer here today. And yeah, it's been just very pleasant. So thank you all for your excellent work and your excellent contributions to knowledge.